This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. This is part 4 and the final installment of my series on the explorer and spy, Zebulon Montgomery Pike. You may rest assured that your services are held in high estimation by the President of the United States, the public much indebted to you for the enterprising, preserving, and judicious manner in which you have performed. Secretary of War Henry Dearborn to Captain Pike, February 24th, 1808. I ended the previous episode with Pike discovering the rumors of the Burr conspiracy, which I've hinted at many times. But what exactly was the Burr conspiracy, or Burr plot? To start with, who was Aaron Burr? Aaron Burr was the first vice president of Thomas Jefferson from 1801 to 1805. Important to remember that up until 1804, the vice president was the loser of the Democratic vote for president. So you ran without a vice in those early days, and your second in command was the guy who you beat. Can you just imagine the most recent election? Obviously, things were a lot different back then when it came to each post's power, like president and vice president, and, well, actually everything was different. But naturally, that kind of political relationship can cause a lot of problems. And it did, such as with the ambitious and always slighted Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was born in the province of New Jersey, shortly before the states were even the states. He became an orphan rather young, but his family members raised him, and he went to theology school at 13. And he was well on his way to some such academic career until, lo and behold, the Revolutionary War broke out, at which point he signed on with the Continental Army. During the war, Burr fought under Benedict Arnold. Yes, that guy, the traitor guy. Burr marched under Arnold before the invasion of Quebec for 300 miles from Maine to that Canadian city, and it was the autumn of 1775. Arnold was so impressed with the guy that he sent Burr even further to find a certain General Montgomery, who had just taken Montreal. Montgomery and Burr make it back to Quebec to fight, but Montgomery is killed. And afterwards, Burr tries to save the man's corpse. It's pretty tragic. Montgomery's dead weight and the snow ultimately forced Burr to leave the general's body behind. Burr then heads back down south, where he's under the command of General Washington. He was only in the general's staff, though, so he quit to be on the battlefield. That's where he proved himself a genuine hero. He saved a whole bunch of American patriots' lives. Yet, the man was denied a commendation or a promotion, which obviously infuriated Burr towards Washington. But he was eventually promoted, and he yet again proved himself continually capable during battle, at least until after 3 years of fighting, when in 1778 an artillery shell and heat stroke done him in at the Battle of Monmouth. Burr requested some medical leave from old Washington, but the man denied it, which was another cut by the future president. Burr would eventually resign from the army during the war due to health, but he would continue to be useful, right up until us patriots won. After the war, he would marry, but she would pass away and only one of their children would survive. With the war over, Burr would naturally move to politics, and he would serve in the New York State Assembly. He was still in the military at this time of the 1780s, and in the 1790s, he would be elected a New York State Senator. And this is where he really made enemies. He railed against not only the Federalist Hamilton, but also Washington, and then he resigned his seat as senator. He would lose a presidential election to all the other founding fathers in 1796, which apparently shocked him. He was then passed over by Adams in favor of Washington for commanding general of U.S. forces, another cut by Washington. The hits just keep stacking up against the war hero Burr. He wanted not to be crowned king of the states, but he did want the ultimate source of power, the presidency. He would run again. In 1799, though, that's when the political intrigue increases for Burr. In that year, he founded his own bank in New York City against the Federalists' wishes, aka against Hamilton's wishes. By now, he counted himself among the Democratic Republicans. The most prominent Federalist was Hamilton. Hamilton didn't like that Burr created this bank in New York on account of the Federalists having a monopoly on banks in the Northeast. There was a lot of political intrigue and trickery by Burr, which allowed him to establish this bank, which was called Manhattan Company. Not anything about a bank. Needless to say, bad blood fumed between Burr and Hamilton. But because of this whole banking thing, Burr fought a duel with a man who was the husband to Hamilton's sister-in-law. The duel ended with both Burr and the other guy missing, and then a gentlemanly handshake ensued, but, well, if you know your history, you know where this is going. In the 1800 election, Burr used the infamous Tammany Hall to get votes in New York, along with his hated bank. It's all well beyond the scope of this series, but Jefferson and Burr tied electoral college votes. Burr was so close to the presidency he could taste it. But Burr was never meant to be president in this election, and everyone knew it. Burr refused to surrender the presidency to Jefferson, but ultimately, it was not meant to be. So Thomas Jefferson won and Burr got vice. The problem was, Jefferson never trusted Burr, and he totally closed the door on his vice with all matters of running the nation. Therefore, Burr was not a candidate as vice president in the following election of 1804 after the laws had been changed. Shut out of national politics, Burr then ran for governor of New York State in 1804, but he lost by the widest margin up to that point in the state's history. Obviously, Clinton, the then vice president to Jefferson, and Hamilton both opposed Burr, which he blamed for his loss. Hamilton would even call Burr, quote, a dangerous man and one who ought not to be trusted with the reins of government, end quote. How right Hamilton was. For this important year, 1804, is when he probably began his plot to crown himself Emperor of the West. Clearly, the eastern states wanted nothing to do with the war hero. But this animosity between Burr and Hamilton would only increase. It had started 15 years prior, and by now, it was costing Burr everything he had in the political realm. Letters between the two were exchanged, arguments ensued, and eventually Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel. In 1804, dueling was outlawed in the state of New York, so the two chose a certain spot in the state of New Jersey. It happened to be the same spot Hamilton's son had been killed 3 years earlier in a duel. Well, this duel between Burr and Hamilton would end equally as tragic for the senior Hamilton. He would be mortally shot just above the hip. The bullet pierced his liver and spine, while Hamilton's bullet was shot harmlessly into the air. I couldn't imagine my son dying in a duel or a fight or what have you, and then me myself fighting on that same grounds and also dying in the same spot. Actually, that's kind of poetic. Burr was charged with murder in both New Jersey and New York, but he would never be tried for the crime. It didn't matter anyways, his political career was now over. He first went to South Carolina before eventually returning to Washington, D.C. to finish his term as vice president. I mean, imagine how awkward those months must have been. Now, here is where the conspiracy takes off in earnest. But I do have to backtrack a little bit. While vice president, Burr had convinced Jefferson, As I have gone over previously, Burr convinced the president to have his Revolutionary War friend, James Wilkinson, put in charge of the Louisiana Territory. I've already covered that, but the traitor Wilkinson was indeed put in charge of the massive tract of land as both a civilian and a military leader. Because remember, Wilkinson was also the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army. Despite working for Spain and Burr, but mostly for himself. Also, while vice president, Burr, we now know, had contacted Britain's minister to the United States, Anthony Merry. Burr, unbelievably and traitorously, offered Merry all the help he could give to Britain in taking over the western territory of the United States. Merry, delighted with this news, told London of Burr's offer to, quote, effect a separation of the western part of the United States, end quote. All Burr wanted in return was some money, and some ships that he would be able to use in his conquest of Mexico and the Louisiana Territory. The following year in 1805, when his vice presidency ended, Burr headed to the frontier of the recently purchased Louisiana Territory, now ran by Wilkinson, where he himself, Burr, had leased 40,000 acres of land from the Spanish crown. Burr began his journey in New York State, and he slowly made his way to his massive land in present-day Louisiana, and all along the way, the man attempted to gather supporters and colonizers to this particular spot near New Orleans. That's where they would stage the invasion. One man, a rich Irishman named Herman Blennerhassett, he was one of his most ardent and loyal followers. This man, Harmon, he built a mansion on the Ohio River where he lived with his wife and children for a little while. Harmon would eventually offer his private island as a place to train Burr's future army for the invasion westward and southward. Before Burr made it down south, at about the same time that Pike was on his Mississippi River expedition, before our southwestern one, while Pike was gone, Burr visited Wilkinson before he headed south to New Orleans. And Burr met with the man to gain his trust and his forces. Even Andrew Jackson was ready to assist Burr with his Tennessee militia in case Burr's war panned out. But Burr also secured the backing of the Mexico Society in New Orleans, which was kind of like a proto-Knights of the Golden Circle group who wanted to take mostly Texas from Spain. By the time Burr returned to Washington, D.C. in November of 1805, he had plenty of men, societies, and money to carry out his planned empire, which would happen through annexation and invasion. Although importantly, the British backing never did arrive. Also worrying to Burr were the whispers and rumors of his plot, beginning to be published in newspapers in the East. But Burr was not bothered, because war with Spain seemed inevitable. Even President Jefferson realized it was coming. So everything was falling into place for the Burr conspiracy to finally blossom. Seeing his bright future on the horizon, in 1806, Burr sent a secret coded message to Wilkinson, which outlined his entire plan. The letter would become known to us as the Cipher Letter. This letter would be pretty damning in the near future. Amazingly, Burr also sent a letter to the then Spanish diplomat, but future Mexican Prime Minister, Carlos Martinez de Araujo y Tacón. And this letter confessed his plan of taking not only Spanish lands, but the capital, Washington, D.C. The man certainly had ambitions, way more so than even Wilkinson, who ultimately completely destroys Burr's hopes and crumbles the entire conspiracy. As I talked about before, the war between Spain and the U.S. never happened, and it never happened because, Wilkinson put a stop to it. Then, Wilkinson, in an attempt to cover his own butt, will spill the beans and hand over the cipher letter to President Jefferson. He told Jefferson that he came across it, you see. It wasn't addressed to him, obviously. In December of 1806, the Ohio militia seized Harmon Blennerhassett's island and ransacked his mansion. By then, though, Burr and his militia, or maybe 100 men, had already boarded boats and were headed to New Orleans. It was there, importantly, that Wilkinson had told the man he would supply more men and materiel. But months before this, Wilkinson had already confessed the plot Wilkinson knew it was fruitless. Plus, he still had his man out in the Spanish territory being a spy, that man being Pike. Burr would eventually be captured on February 13, 1807, while Pike was waiting in his stockade in the San Luis Valley to be arrested by Spanish authorities. Pike knew nothing of this conspiracy. Wilkinson was never indicted for treason, although he came very close. The foreman of the grand jury, a man named John Randolph, would say of Wilkinson that he was a quote-unquote mammoth of iniquity, and that he was, quote, the only man I ever saw who was from the bark to the very core a villain. A bit harsh for the man who ended the conspiracy, albeit to save his own skin. Although it is true that Wilkinson doctored the cipher letter to take out any mention of his own name, and even Burr's name. Burr will never do time for treason. He would flee to Europe and try to jumpstart even more European invasions of America, but to no avail. He would then return to New York just before the War of 1812, where he will change his name and be quite a successful attorney. But he would die in obscurity. So that, dear listeners, was the Burr conspiracy, of which Pike first read about on March 27, 1807, at the Presidio Carrizal, while he was being escorted through New Spain by Malgares and a plethora of dragoons. So let's get back to Pike's adventure. 4 days after learning of the plot, and after 3 days of marching through the harsh Chihuahuan desert, on the 31st, Pike ended up in a place known as El Peñol. And there, interestingly, Pike saw many labors being carried out by criminals in irons. Ever more interestingly, he met a Catalonian who, quote, was but a short time from Spain and whose dialect was such that he could scarcely be understood by Malgares, and whose manners were much more like those of a citizen of our western frontiers than of a subject of a despotic prince, end quote. Catalonia has always attempted to stay somewhat separate from the rest of Spain. The territory and its people, therefore, were always distinct from those of the rest of the peninsula, which is why Malgares, a noble, had a hard time understanding this man from Catalonia. Finally, on the 2nd of April, 1807, Pike and his men, as well as Malgares and the dragoons, they all arrived at their destination of Chihuahua, which is where they were to meet with General Salcedo. Pike remarks that although Malgares had done an exceptional job at his mission in going to the Pawnee villages and then capturing Pike and bringing him back down, it appeared to Pike that Malgares was more afraid of the meeting with the commandant than even he himself was, despite Pike being a prisoner in all but name. That doesn't mean that Pike wasn't completely fearless. He writes in the journal that this commandant, quote, depended our future destiny, at least until our country could interfere in our behalf, end quote. After all, just a few days before, he had seen men in chains building and laboring in the desert. Could that be his, Pike's, future? At the general's, the Americans were halted in the hall of the guard, while Malgares went in to talk to the commandant. While Pike and them were waiting, though, another Frenchman came up to Pike to talk, but he was quote-unquote frowned into silence by Zeb, since he suspected the man was no doubt a spy. Finally, Malgares returned and ushered Pike in to meet the general. And I will now quote the journal for their conversation. You have given us and yourself a great deal of trouble, on my part entirely unsought, and on that of the Spanish voluntary. Where are your papers? Under charge of Lieutenant Malgares, who was then ordered to have my small trunk brought in, which being done, a Lieutenant Walker came in, who was a native of New Orleans, his father an Englishman, his mother a French woman, and spoke both languages equally well, also the Spanish. He was a lieutenant of dragoons in the Spanish service and master of the military school at Chihuahua. This same young gentleman was employed by Mr. Andres Ellicott as a deputy surveyor on the Florida line between the United States and Spain in the years 97 and 98. End quote. After that brief conversation and the introduction of Walker, General Salcedo ordered Pike to take out all of his papers and explain each and every one of them. The general then separated each piece of paper into two piles, one pile being papers relevant to the expedition, and the other pile, papers that were personal, mostly from Pike's wife. This latter pile, Pike noted that the general let Zeb keep in his own pocket, since they were of a private nature. The general then told Pike he would keep and examine these relevant papers, at least for a while, before he commanded that Pike make a brief sketch of his entire journey thus far. Pike agreed to do it, but in the journal he wrote that he wished he hadn't. He wrote, quote, "This I would have positively refused had I had an idea that it was his determination to keep the papers." End quote. Zeb would be deceived yet again. But this truly was an international matter. And remember, Pike was there, after all, to spy on New Spain at a time when the two nations almost went to war. The general then dismissed them, but told Pike that he was to stay with Walker, since they spoke the same language and, they were from the same country. But Zeb was right in thinking there was more to it. Obviously, Walker was there to spy on Pike. Later that night, Pike and Robinson returned with Malgares to the palace, where the three of them were the only guests of the general. Although, I guess there was also a treasurer and a priest. Pike and his men would spend the next 26 days in Chihuahua. But their time was not whiled away under house arrest. They were free men, after all. Instead, there was a lot they got to do and see, including some intrigue and some tension. Pike met many important people, both men and women. A few of the women truly impressed him. Zeb also met Malgares' wife, whom he thought was the most beautiful woman in New Spain. He tried to have Doc Robinson be allowed to heal 2 Spanish soldiers who were withering away in sickness, but, quote, "the jealousy and envy of the Spanish doctors made it impracticable." Zeb also learned the art of the siesta while in Chihuahua, as in a sweet nap after lunch. I tried to get my boss, who was also my father, to let me take a siesta in the office, but he never fully got on board. On the 8th of April, Pike was shown a gun that belonged to the aforementioned ill-fated Nolan party. And then on the 9th, he actually met yet another surviving member of said party. This man's name was David Farrow, and he used to be Pike's father's ensign, and Pike had actually met him back in 1794. Zeb writes that David Farrow, quote, "possessed a brave soul and had withstood every oppression since his being made prisoner with astonishing fortitude." End quote. Now, this meeting between the two Americans was not, shall we say, approved. Farrow was not supposed to leave his confinement at the village of San Geronimo. But Pike remarks, quote, "a countryman, an acquaintance, and formerly a brother soldier in a strange land, in distress, had ventured much to see me. Could I deny him the interview from any motives of delicacy? No. Forbid it, humanity. Forbid every sentiment of my soul." End quote. How could he refuse to see this imprisoned American and former friend just because it might upset the general? They met with tears in their eyes, according to Pike, and Farrow told him all about his adventure and capture and what it had been like living in Chihuahua as a prisoner. Pike then promised him that he would, quote, "do all I could for him consistent with my character and honor." End quote. And he will. Before Farrow left, Zeb gave him, quote, "what my purse afforded, not what my heart dictated." End quote. Meaning he gave the poor man all he could, not what he truly wanted, which was the man's freedom. The next few weeks were filled with writing, reading, learning Spanish, meetings, public walks, dining with friends, drinking, fandangos, of course, and even on one occasion, quote unquote, nothing extraordinary. Pike describes Chihuahua in many places, but George R. Matthews, and Thomas Jefferson's agent for Empire, sums up what he said nicely with this paragraph. "A city of 7,000 people, Chihuahua impressed Pike with its ornate churches, splendid town plaza, wonderful city park, well-built aqueduct with reservoir, and excellent hospital. Pike described the town as an oblong square on the east side of a small stream, which discharges itself into the river Conchos. On the southern edge of town stood a small but elegant church, while the main church, the most superb building we saw in New Spain, dominated the town plaza. The whole front was covered with statues of the apostles and the different saints, set in niches of the wall, and the windows and doors were ornamented with sculpture. Its cost, with decorations, was $1,500,000. The city park occupied the south end of town. The public walk, formed by 3 rows of trees whose branches nearly entwined over the heads of the passengers below, had several benches along the pathways. At the end of the walks there were circular seats on which, in the evening, the company collected and amused themselves with a guitar, songs in Spanish, Italian, and French, adapted to the voluptuous manners of the country. Outside the southern edge of town was a large aqueduct which conveys the water round it to the east into the main stream below the town, in the center of which is raised a reservoir for the water. On the west side of town stood another church for the military, a superb hospital, the church for the monks of St. Francis, St. Domingo, and the military academy. Soldiers patrolled the city at night, and each evening stopped every person at 9 o'clock and examined them. But Pike only had to utter this password, Americans, to freely move about town at night. End all quotes. Also during this time, Pike dictated his story to Walker in English, who would then write it down in Spanish. The entire time, Zeb continued the ruse that he was mistaken on where the Red River's headwaters were. Remember, he had the map in his possession, which clearly showed exactly where each river was and where it flowed. He knew he was heading towards the Rio Grande and ultimately into Spanish territory. But he left that part out when telling Walker their expedition's story. Although, now that Salcedo had all of Pike's papers, the general had the copy of the Humboldt map which Wilkinson had showed Pike and which Pike had copied. And he had even added the day's distances between each major spot. The ruse could not hold up forever. Another ruse he kept up, which was not very wise, was the lie that Robinson was sent down to collect the debt, and then he was to return to them on the Conejos River. And then they all rode that river, which he assumed to be the Red, back to Natchitoches in canoes they were going to make. Walker had to be scratching his head with that lie. Why would Robinson come back when all y'all were stranded and hungry in the snow with low ammo? How were they ever going to make it back to the States in that condition? Pike should have, as George R. Matthews points out, just said, "Yeah, I got lost, and I knew Santa Fe was close and we needed help. Consequences be damned." Instead, he stuck to his plan, which he told Wilkinson he was going to do. Not to mention, if they were never going to go to Santa Fe, why have a debt collection notice for someone living in Santa Fe? Oh, sure, Pike said it was because in case they ran into a Spaniard on the Red River. But let's be real. The Spanish had to be seeing right through all of these lies, which they were. Up in Santa Fe, on April 12th, 1807, Governor Alencaster, believing Pike to have been a scouting party for a much larger invasion force, he mobilized some scouts of his own. He sent troops and scouts to Taos, Pecos, and other places on the frontier to post up and send word if any more Americans were seen heading their way. The governor also sent out De Almanza and Sotelo, 2 men who were in this story previously. The governor sent them out with 8 soldiers and 30 militiamen to each of the major mountain passes to guard against any more invading Anglos. By now, word of the Burr plot was, after all, trickling down into New Spain. It wasn't outlandish to believe war was still on the horizon. Before these troops could leave for the mountain passes, though, one of Pike's men, Thomas Dougherty, Pike's personal attendant, whose foot was rotting off, before the governor could send his troops north and northeast, Dougherty the American told Alencaster that 3,000 to 4,000 American troops were in fact on their way. Dougherty said that Pike was supposed to be home by Christmas Eve, 1806, and if he wasn't, Wilkinson would assume they were taken prisoner, and he'd send in an army to rescue them. Dougherty did not only say this to the governor once, but 2 times. Well, after hearing that, Alencaster gathered a force of retired officers, a few soldiers, and 200 militiamen to go up to the east side of the Sangre de Cristos from Taos and repel any invasion. He also sent out another group of retired officers, a few soldiers and 200 more militiamen, to the north to back up Dalmanza near the Great Sand Dunes in the San Luis Valley. Even though Doherty had made it all up, the governor was not taking the threat lightly. As well he shouldn't have. It turns out, as he was preparing all these defenses, rumors began to swirl in Santa Fe that the Americans were indeed coming. And to the governor's horror, he overheard these conversations, quote, without observing any displeasure among these people, or hearing them express animosity, or willingness to risk their lives to guard their homes, end quote. So the people of New Mexico were excited at the possibility of the Americans coming. They weren't going to die for the Spanish crown, and they weren't afraid of the Spanish crown or the Americans. Back down in Chihuahua, Pike eventually wrote a letter to General Salcedo asking if he was ever going to get his trunk of papers back. And if he wasn't, Pike asked that the general at least offer Pike, quote, a copy of them, and the reasons for their seizure and detention, in order that my government may be enabled to make the proper application to the Spanish court for an explanation, end quote. In other words, why are you keeping my American government property? He also told Salcedo that the reason why he was asking so soon after arriving is because he hoped his injured men, who he had left behind, he hoped they were on the way, and once they arrived, he hoped to leave New Spain as soon as possible. He wrote, quote, I feel conscious that I am as anxious to arrive on the territories of the United States as your excellency must be for me to quit the dominions of his Catholic Majesty, end quote. And he is not wrong. He also explains in this letter that, hey, I could have destroyed all this stuff on the way down to Chihuahua, you know, but seeing as war is not imminent, I figured my destruction of them would implicate my character as a military man. Of course, he did not tell the general that he tried to hide the journal and map when he was up in Santa Fe, but then he was subsequently tricked by the governor. He also told the general that the only reason he was making sketches and maps along the way was to help the U.S. and Spanish governments in this Louisiana boundary dispute. The general did not bite, and he would ultimately keep all the documents, journals, and maps, including the recreation of the Humboldt map, which proved Pike knew exactly where he was. Robinson, meanwhile, was also writing to Salcedo. He claimed he only joined the party after asking Wilkinson 4 times. And he was only in the party to give the debt collection in Santa Fe. And then surprisingly, well, not so surprisingly you'll hear Robinson's story at the end, but surprisingly to Salcedo, no doubt, was Robinson's wish to stay in Chihuahua and become a, quote, subject of his Catholic Majesty, end quote. Why did he want to become Spanish? Robinson will ultimately be sent back to the States, but he'll return to Chihuahua, as I will go over later. Salcedo himself was also writing letters. A major letter was written on April 8th to Wilkinson, in which he writes essentially, look, I found the documents in the map which prove that, quote, an offense of magnitude had been committed against His Majesty, end quote. He also said on account of this, every one of these men should be imprisoned as invaders and spies. But he wrote, as a gesture of harmony and goodwill from the Spanish government, Salcedo was allowing Pike and his men, quote-unquote, full liberty to return to the United States. This was certainly good news to Wilkinson and Pike and his men. But as George R. Matthews points out, there were other good reasons besides Spanish goodwill. Matthews writes, quote, aside from Spanish-American harmony, Salcedo had several practical reasons to release Pike. First, and probably most important, his release prevented giving the United States an excuse to send troops to rescue the Americans. Second, releasing them would remove men who not only sympathized, but also, Salcedo believed, actively encouraged Mexican political antagonism toward their Spanish rulers. And third, as hosts to a lost American exploring expedition, Spain could legitimately request compensation for expenses incurred, while Pike and his men were being escorted back to the United States territory. Salcedo also told Wilkinson that he was keeping Pike's papers. A list was made and a copy given to Pike. Among the documents kept by Salcedo, the 2 most incriminating were the map Pike had drawn before we left St. Louis showing the route to Santa Fe, and his July 22, 1806 letter to Wilkinson detailing his plans to deceive the Spanish authorities by pretending to be lost, searching for the Red River. End quote. The gig was up. Both parties knew it. Salcedo would write to another Spaniard I'll talk about in a second, and he would say that Pike, quote, has contradicted himself, not telling the truth about anything. End quote. War had been avoided. Peace would settle. New Spain had her own problems after all. The only course of action now would be to release these non-prisoners and let them go back home. Even though the Spanish authorities had by now fully realized the true nature of the mission which they had intercepted, which had been the plan all along. But Salcedo wasn't done writing yet. He also wrote a letter to the Spanish ambassador to the United States, a certain Marqués de Casaurijo. In that letter, he enclosed a copy of every important document that he had confiscated from Pike, including the map in the letter. He wrote the ambassador that these documents would reveal, quote, the pretext under which General Wilkinson sought to hide the real purposes of the aforesaid expedition, end quote. As in finding the headwaters and returning the Osage and talking to the Pawnee, all that was a pretext for the true mission, spying on New Spain for a future invasion and expansion of U.S. borders. Although, U.S. borders might be stretching it. Who knows if it was for Burr, for Wilkinson, or for Jefferson. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Salcedo ended his letter to the ambassador by pretty much saying, yes, I know the royal order of October 12, 1805. That means I have to detain these men, but since they're already here and they already completed their mission, I should give them back. But have no fear. I am going to keep the diary's notes on observation sketches of the terrain through which he had passed. Therefore, this information will never reach Washington, D.C., or Wilkinson, or Jefferson, etc. On the 20th of April, a few things happened. First of all, Pike and his men learned of a quote-unquote commercial treaty having been signed between the U.S. and Great Britain. And this alarmed the Spanish dons and the general, because what if this was a pretext for an alliance, for an offensive against Spain and her colonies? Also on that day, Pike will write yet another letter, but not to Salcedo, instead to Wilkinson. It pretty much summed up his entire journey thus far, including his confusion. Now, it is pretty easy to imagine Salcedo read all communications emanating from Pike, so he must have read this letter, gone over to Pike's papers, pulled out the Humboldt map, seen what Pike had used on his journey, seen that Pike knew exactly where he was, and Salcedo must have just thought, this guy just won't quit this ruse. Pike also wrote that, have no fear, we will be leaving once my other injured men arrive. But he closed the letter with, hey, I better get a promotion for this. He wrote something to the effect of, I hope to obtain a Louisiana Boundary Commissioner appointment, since I have more knowledge of this country through which the line must pass than any other officer my age. Man, he was right about that. Lastly, on that day, Pike and his men learned, quote, that an American officer had gone on to the city of Mexico. This was an enigma to us, inexplicable, as we conceived that the jealousy of the Spanish government would have prevented any foreign officer from penetrating the country. And what the United States could send an authorized agent to the viceroyalty when the Spanish government had at the seat of our government a charge des affaires served but to darken the conjectures. End quote. So, about this, Pike would have been heartbroken to know that this man, Mr. Walter Burling, had been sent by Pike's very good friend and almost father figure. This man had been sent by his boss, Wilkinson, the Spanish spy. Burling and a letter had been sent by Wilkinson to the viceroyalty informing the Spanish that it was he, Wilkinson, who had prevented the Burr conspiracy to invade New Spain from occurring. And in addition to some praises, Wilkinson would lack $100,000 reward for his efforts. The Spanish would never pay Wilkinson that amount. The time for Pike's departure was fast approaching, and on the 23rd, Salcedo wrote to Zeb to essentially tell him just that. And also, oh yeah, I'm keeping all your chest of documents and papers forever. Pike doesn't record his reaction, but I'm sure he was furious. Now, the reason for Zeb's departure shortly would be revealed on the 24th of April, when a government official visited Pike and told him, quote, that the government had been informed that in conversations in all societies, Robinson and myself had held forth political maxims and principles, which, if just, I must be conscious if generally disseminated, would in a very few years be the occasion of a revolt of those kingdoms, that those impressions had taken such effect as that it was no uncommon thing, in the circles in which we associated, to hear the comparative principles of a republican and monarchical government discussed, and even the allegiance due, in case of certain events, to the court called in question, that various characters of consideration had indulged themselves in those conversations, all of whom were noted and would be taken care of. But that as it respected myself and companion, it was the desire of His Excellency that whilst in the dominions of Spain we would not hold forth any conversations whatsoever, either on the subject of religion or politics. End quote. So basically, Pike and Robinson and Pike's men were just out there in the kingdom of New Spain, spouting and spreading the virus of democracy and republicanism, and ending the monarchy. Early Americans just could not help themselves when it came to their revolutionary government. I have talked about this before in my Civil War series, but our founding fathers were truly revolutionaries. Their thinking was against God and civilized society, according to the Europeans. Our revolution certainly spread to France, where it became overwhelmed by the spirit of the devil before being saved by Napoleon. And then it spread to Haiti, where the devil himself led that revolution. The Spanish were correct in believing this virus, that Pike, and especially Robinson, was spreading among these Spanish subjects would become dangerous. Only 3 years from Pike's stay in Chihuahua, Mexico would declare its independence from Spain during the invasion of the peninsula by Napoleon. And listen to that line, which Pike wrote down in the journal in italics. All of those people who discussed these things with Pike and Robinson were noted and would be taken care of. That must have made Pike's heart skip a beat. What did that even mean, taken care of? Pike immediately defended himself by pretty much saying, look, I only spoke about religion and politics with people in high office, who, no doubt, have all their allegiance to Spain and Catholicism. He said, quote, I had never gone amongst the poor and illiterate, preaching up republicanism or a free government, end quote. He then defended himself about talking about Catholicism by saying, quote, I had only combated some of what I conceived to be its illiberal dogmas, but that I had spoken of it, in all instances, as a respectable branch of the Christian religion, which, as well as all others, was tolerated in the United States. End quote. All other Christian religions, huh? But he continues and says again, and I'm paraphrasing, look, I am not a prisoner of war, as y'all have repeatedly informed me, but instead, I, quote, should always give my opinions freely, either as to politics or religion, but at the same time with urbanity and a proper respect to the legitimate authorities of the country where I was. End quote. Basically, this is your fault that I'm a free man. Had I have been imprisoned, I would not be free to say such things, which is a bold defense for sure. This government official replied, quote, well, you may then rest assured your conduct will be represented in no very favorable point of view to your government. End quote. Now, who is this guy kidding? Thomas Jefferson said, which I stated in the first episode, quote, we should have such an empire for liberty as she has never surveyed since creation. And he also said, I am persuaded no constitution was ever before so well calculated as ours for extensive empire and self-government. End quote. Jefferson would give Pike a medal if he knew he was spreading the gospel of liberty. Pike's final remark to this unnamed government official was, quote, to my government I am certainly responsible, and to no other. End quote. After this threat by Salcedo, Pike and Robinson met up with Malgares and some other friends, whom they immediately told. Some of them seemed alarmed by this news. Would they be arrested, or worse? Malgares, though, ever the Spaniard, had, quote, the most incorruptible loyalty and the confidence of the government, End quote. Later that night, Pike and Robinson, after talking with Malagades, decided to have a, quote, determination only to be silent and watch events, end quote. Smart move. The final thing, well, okay, not the final thing, but the last thing to happen to Pike that evening was when Pike and Robinson confronted Walker. They suspected him to be a spy. Pike admits in the journal that the two had held many a conversation in front of Walker for the sole purpose of finding out if Walker was indeed a spy. But Walker flat out refused. He told Pike and Robinson that if they, quote, calculated on making him a carrier of news, we were mistaken, that he despised it, end quote. So Walker could seemingly be depended upon. But things were getting tense in Chihuahua. So the actual final thing that happened on the 23rd for our group, although not for Pike, who won't find out about this, but on the 23rd, before all the previous stuff happened, Robinson wrote another letter to Salcedo, since he had not gotten a reply yet. Amazingly, Doc Robinson wrote to the general and volunteered to convince the general to let him stay. He volunteered to lead a Spanish expedition north to the Oregon Territory to claim it for Spain. He boldly lied and said that he had extensive knowledge of the area and that he had submitted a, quote, memorandum some time ago to the Congress of the United States to colonize a part of that country, which is along the Western Ocean to about 45 degrees of northern latitude, end quote. He then, amazingly, because there is no evidence in the Library of Congress that he ever made that memorandum, he told the general that he had, quote, received their approval and sponsorship, end quote. As you'll hear later, Doc Robinson is a strange fella. How are so many patriots in this story so disloyal to the Union? Except Pike. I reckon the War of 1812 solidified a lot of Americans' love and respect for the United States. I mentioned Andrew Jackson was willing to send his Tennessee militia to help Burr. But there is more to that. Andrew Jackson also housed Burr while he was hiding from the feds on treason charges in his own house. But look at Jackson during the Second War against Britain. He became a hero and eventually one of our greatest presidents. Robinson ended the letter with, astonishingly, a request to be detained by the general in Chihuahua, so his best friend Pike and the other Americans wouldn't suspect him of wishing to switch allegiances. He gave 2 reasons for wanting to be detained. Quote, so that the proposed Oregon expedition may not be known to any foreign power, and so as to avoid the confiscation of his possessions in the United States, which would be the case if it were known that I was remaining here voluntarily, end quote. I guess the man was serious. And Pike really knew nothing of this, and in a while he will write in the journal that he and his men had, quote, been for some time suspicious that the doctor was to be detained, end quote. Probably because the doc kept telling them that he was going to be detained. But ultimately, Salcedo would deny the doc's request to stay in Chihuahua, and he would indeed be sent back to the United States with Pike, which, according to the journal, quote, diffused general joy through all the party, end quote. And what was Doc's game here? The world may never know, but his future revolutionary actions may hold some hints. The following day on the 24th, Pike got more interesting instructions. Salcedo told the lieutenant that he, Robinson, and the 6 Americans that had traveled with him were leaving soon, but without the Americans who were trailing behind, as in the injured men and the interpreter. Salcedo then told Pike that he needed to leave instructions for the stragglers, that once they arrived in Chihuahua, they would need to turn over their black powder, bullets, and horses. Pike returned with, yes, I'll do that. They will hand over their powder, except what they can fill in their horns and their ammo, but not the horses. Salcedo decided that was good enough. And before Pike left, the Generalissimo asked Pike to return the following evening for dinner. There is a very interesting story that Pike records on the 27th of April, as he was preparing to leave. Pike meets the first black man he's seen in the Southwest, a man named Caesar. He had belonged to someone on the aforementioned Nolan expedition, but he was now in the charge of Walker, who, again, was also from Mississippi. So there was some connection. Caesar exclaimed to Pike when he entered Walker's residency on this day, which is where Pike and Robinson had been staying. When the Negro entered the house, he shouted, "What? All gone?" Pike asked Caesar what he meant, and the former slave said, "Well, there used to be maps of all the New Spain provinces up on the walls, but now, since y'all have been here, they've all been put away." Walker was present during this, and he and Pike have a conversation about why Walker became a subject of Spain instead of the United States. And it boiled down to the very same reason Benedict Arnold and Aaron Burr betrayed the Union. Walker's father had been ill-treated by his superiors. So now Walker ran the military school in Chihuahua, and he worked on public waterworks as an engineer, and he generally enjoyed life down in New Spain. And it's here Zeb realizes that all along, Walker really was a spy. He writes, quote, "Although he, Walker, candidly confessed his disgust to their service, manners, morals, and political establishments, yet he never made a communication to us which he was bound in honor to conceal, but on the contrary, fulfilled the station of informer, which in that country is considered no disgrace, with great punctuality and fidelity. In this city the proverb was literally true, that the walls had ears, for there was scarcely anything could pass that His Excellency did not know in a few hours after." End quote. Finally, the day of departure arrived on the afternoon of April 28, 1807. It was the afternoon, because it took Pike and Robinson so long to say goodbye to all their new friends. But eventually, Malgares and 65 dragoons met up with all of the Americans present, and Malgares told Zeb, "I will be escorting you for some time." And this was a relief to Pike, since the two had become really good friends by now. But curiously, Malgares also told Pike that, "Look, the general told me you're not allowed to make any astronomical observations, i.e. map making." To which Pike replied, "Well, I haven't done so yet, have I?" But Pike would very soon push the limits of this order. It is important to note the number of Spanish enlisted dragoons that have been accompanying the Americans thus far. I mentioned earlier the New Mexican governor sending about 6 soldiers and 200 militiamen. This was an expensive and big deal to send that many armed and trained Spanish soldiers from Chihuahua to Louisiana. Not to mention from Chihuahua up to the San Luis Valley, and then all the way back down to Chihuahua. This is just one of the reasons that Spain won't be in charge of New Spain for much longer. But I have also covered that in my Apache series and even in my Spanish Conquest of New Mexico series. How is it feasible that Spain run New Spain and also the furthest colony of New Mexico from Mexico City, reasonably and well? It was not feasible. Hence why in a few years it all comes crumbling down. On the second day of their travel, the 29th of April, Malgares was forced to be the military man again against Pike. Quote, "When about to make my journal, Malgares changed color and informed me it was his orders I should not take notes, but added, 'You have a good memory, and when you get to Coahuila, you can bring it all up.' End quote. Meaning, I am not permitted to let you write a single thing down. But you're a smart lad. Write it all down when I leave you at Coahuila." Pike remarks in the journal that after he heard this, he almost refused to comply. But, quote, "Thinking for a moment of the many politenesses I had received from his hands, induced me merely to bow assent with a smile." End quote. They then continued after drinking a good amount of milk, which I thought was a funny little anecdote. Hopefully it wasn't too hot. It is true, all of his journals and documents have been confiscated, so everything we read about this southwestern expedition was from memory later. Which, of course, means you cannot take everything written as gospel and direct quotes, but rather the most true retelling of the man's adventure. But that being said, this last part was thankfully preserved by Pike by some ingenious methods, which I will talk about shortly. Regardless of Malgares' commands, though, the young lieutenant endeavored to ride away on his own with some pretext of having to heed the call of nature, and not without some considerable degree of trouble, according to his words, where he in fact did write some notes peaceably under a bush. On the 30th, after riding 24 miles that day and 30 miles the previous day, Pike became ill, but he soldiered on, and they would go another 43 miles on the 30th before arriving in a spot near the Conchos River and Fort Conchos. So from Chihuahua, they actually headed southeast even deeper into Mexico. And of course, I will have a map for this episode, and I've had a map for all the previous episodes. On the night of the 1st of May, 1807, Pike realized that Malgarez was, quote, much more acute than ever, end quote, meaning he was always on the lookout for Pike's little notebook and note-taking. So Pike conceived it necessary to secure his notes, which he had thus far clandestinely taken on their route from Chihuahua. He, quote, took my small books and rolled them up in small rolls, and tore a fine shirt to pieces, and wrapped it around the papers and put them down in the barrels of the guns, until we just left room for the tampons, which were then carefully put in. The remainder we secured about our bodies under our shirts, end quote. So the tampons, or tampions, of the guns were to protect the barrels from being filled with dust and dirt and water and whatnot. Barrel coverings, essentially. It took 2 hours for Pike to accomplish this, but he did it, quote-unquote, without discovery and without suspicions. By now, the governor of the Tejas province had received a letter by Salcedo informing him, Antonio Cordero, that a whole bunch of American adventurous spies had infiltrated New Mexico and New Spain, and that now they were being escorted through his territory back to Louisiana, and that he should escort them back to Natchitoches with suitable accommodations. Salcedo also instructed Cordero to, quote, prevent any of them throughout their journey from taking notes, sketching maps, or departing from the route which the whole party is taking, end quote. So the same instructions Malgarez had been given. Salcedo was not an ignorant man, and he knew Pike and his men were on a military reconnaissance mission. So obviously, he was going to make it as hard as possible for the Americans to complete their mission with ease. On the 2nd of May, Malgarez passed his non-captive escorts on to a Criollo Captain Barelo in the city of Guajoquilla, or modern-day Jimenez. Again, this is southeast of Chihuahua. They were heading towards the road that leads to San Antonio, which is why they were taking this circuitous route. But Pike had some words on Barelo, and George R. Matthews sums up better than I would be able to. He sums up this man Barelo and his situation. Here's Matthews. Barelo impressed Pike. Pike believed Barelo to be a gentleman in his manners, generous and frank, and a good soldier. Because Barelo was born a Criollo to Spanish parents, but born in Mexico, Barelo considered his promotion to captain to be his ultimate rank. Legally, Spaniards born in Spain and Criollos were equals, but military policy almost always favored immigrants from Spain with promotion to the senior officer ranks, major and above, while Criollos were restricted to the junior officer level, captain and below. Criollos also experienced this glass ceiling in the government, church, and business hierarchies, which caused most of the discontent and rebellious feeling Pike was hearing about. 3 years after Pike's tour of Mexico, the Criollos began the revolt that in 1821 finally resulted in Mexican independence. End all quotes. So you can see the dangers in Pike and Robinson's conversations with the men and women around New Mexico and Chihuahua. I mean, they were dissatisfied with Spanish rule. On the 3rd, they had an officers' ball, or really a fandango, in this small town which I will not pronounce. And Pike remarks, out of 60 women, only 10 or a dozen were beautiful. By the 6th of May, the Americans, with their new escort of Barelo, they were finally off again. Malgarez accompanied Pike for a bit before the two, quote, bid an eternal adieu. Pike then added, if war does not bring us together in the field of battle opposed as the most deadly enemies, when our hearts acknowledge the greatest friendship. End quote. It's a beautiful way to speak of a friend who is a potential enemy. The rest of the day saw them travel without food or water on the road to San Antonio for 30 miles. On this day of May 6th, after traveling for quite some time in a southeastward direction, they were nearly due south of modern-day Amarillo, but hundreds of miles on the other side of the Rio Grande. It seems like such a circuitous route to take to get back to Louisiana until you realize the terrain of the foreboding Chihuahuan Desert. This day would mark the closest Pike would get to Mexico City, which was his unspoken goal. Although he will later state on the 20th that that day was the closest he would get to Mexico City, it doesn't matter, I reckon. The Marines in a few decades will reach the halls of Montezuma regardless of Pike's efforts. Or maybe because of them. Stay tuned for the upcoming Mexican War series. The next few weeks of marching through Chihuahua, Durango, and Coahuila are marked with some exciting stories. A lot of the sources I read just brushed past this whole time without even mentioning anything, like nothing at all. But I think it's relevant, so I'm going to tell you all about it. On the 11th of May, they reached a town called Mapimi, which is in modern-day Durango, straight south of Big Bend National Park, except many hundreds of miles into Mexico. In the town, Pike witnessed, quote, "The mass of the people were naked and starved wretches. The proprietor of the mines gave us an elegant repast." End quote. So these people are starving. He mentions that. And then the owner of the mine gives them a lavish and elegant meal. At this point, Captain Borrello told Pike to remember that he was not to record anything or report any of this to the American government, to which Pike laughed and confidently replied, quote, "There were disaffected persons sufficient to serve as guides should an army ever come into the country." End quote. He's talking about these starved people, but that was bold words. He could see the stark difference that existed between the people of his free nation and the subjects of this captured nation, and Pike just knew. He knew that all it would take to awaken these people to freedom was a spark of American liberty. So Pike's describing these horrific conditions, and Borrello tells Pike not to record any of it. And Pike laughs in his face and says it would take our army of free men no time at all to turn these wretches into guides for us to invade your capital. Incredibly bold words from the young explorer, adventurer, and spy. On the 12th of May, another interesting event occurred which highlights the rising tensions as Pike and his men get closer to the States and further from men that Pike respected. After awaking to the singing of the birds and the perfumes of the trees, Pike sent 2 of his men into town, but as they were walking, a Spanish dragoon ordered them to halt and turn around, which they did. When they told Pike what had happened, he told them, no, go again, but this time, quote, "If a soldier attempted to stop them, to take him off his horse and flog him." End quote. Pike wrote that he did this because the Spanish captain had given him no orders barring him from sending men into town, and he wanted to see if Captain Borrello would actually issue, Pike, such an order. For Borrello had no authority to do so, in Zeb's mind. Borrello never did give Pike or his men such an order, so the men went into town unmolested. All the while, Zeb was watching to see if anything would happen, which nothing did, and the affair never interrupted our harmony. The rest of that day's journal is a roadmap to future invaders or explorers. It goes into detail where the roads lead to and what you'll pass, such as plantations or savages or cities and mountains. At one point he wrote, quote, "Your guards must either be so strong as to defy the Apaches or calculate to escape them by swiftness, for they, the Apaches, fill those mountains, whence they continually carry on a predatory war against the Spanish settlements and caravans." End quote. If you have not yet, listen to my thorough series on the Athabascan northern invaders and their centuries-long war against encroaching civilization. One of the reasons they were making such a circuitous route was, of course, on account of the Apache, who would soon be sublimated by the Comanche in this part of the continent. But for now, the party of Americans and Spaniards twisted and turned and diverted their course from Chihuahua to San Antonio because of the Apaches and the lack of water and what have you. And Pike made sure to write all of this down. The following day they got to a river, and Pike's man lost his horse, but thankfully it was returned to them by some boys that worked at a local plantation. He awarded them for this and said, quote, "This certainly was a strong proof of their honesty," end quote. He then comments on how little these people are allowed to eat in a day, which was not a lot. On the 14th, 25 Spanish soldiers came into the town they were at with 2 Apaches and irons. Pike writes this of them: "They were noble-looking fellows of large stature and appeared by no means cast down by their misfortunes, although they knew their fate was transportation beyond the sea, never more to see their friends and relations." Then, Pike, because his new nation had yet to face the Apaches, he writes, "Knowing as I did the intention of the Spanish towards those people, I would have liberated them if in my power." Well, your descendants will eventually treat the Apache exactly as the Spanish are now. I mean, the Americans will ship them to Florida and Alcatraz, if you'll recall. Pike then goes over to these Apaches and tells them the Americans are friends, before giving them articles which would be of service if chance offered. Not sure what that means, but it's very interesting to see Pike's view of the Apaches versus how the U.S. Army will see them in 60 years after we conquer and purchase the mountains which they fill. By now, they're marching at night for want of water and the thermometer reading close to 100 degrees. On the night of the 17th of May, defying orders, Pike meets a Catholic priest who, quote, "was extremely anxious for a change of government," end quote. Apparently, they talked on this subject for hours into the night. By the 19th, Captain Morello, not being so well, had decided to defy his orders from Salcedo and was going to just take the main road into Texas. They were lacking water, it was hot, everyone wanted this to be over with. Also that day, Pike met an American Army deserter, and he was so disgusted with the man that he did not help the scoundrel and gave him only a few cents. I thought that was an interesting little anecdote. Like, where did this guy desert from? He thinks Johnston's 2nd Infantry, so I looked him up, but I was unsuccessful. On the 25th, they came to a small town which was commanded by an Irishman named Lieutenant Adams. Pike and his men would be hospitably entertained at the elegant home of the Irishman. The next day, when Pike was out surveying the town, as he did usually, he notes that all the Spanish troops were remarkably polite and saluted Pike every time he passed one. On the 27th, Pike met a certain Don Michon, who had in his employ another American deserter named Pratt. This Don Michon, though, had acquired a considerable quantity of crude and digested information relative to the United States, and when he met with us, his thirst after knowledge of our laws and institutions appeared to be insatiable. So again, Pike's just wandering the countryside of New Spain, fomenting rebellion against the clergy and noblemen, just as Jefferson would want him to do. Don Michon killed a sheep and fed it to the Americans as a thank you for the information and spark of liberty. The following day, Pike gets seriously offended at a certain Hacienda de Encina, which was owned by Don Borrego. There, Pike meets a well-dressed American, and they have a fine conversation while partaking of a cold collation of fruits and confectionery. But later, Pike learns this man is yet another American Army deserter. When Pike learns of this, he confronts the American deserter and pretty much says, "How dare you talk to me, an American officer, while you, a scoundrel, are a deserter?" He says if he opens his mouth to speak to Pike again, he will smack him. So the American slinks away. Pike then goes and finds Don Borrego and says, "Never let this man in my sight again." To which the Don apologizes and tells Pike it won't happen. Zeb really does not like deserters, and it is kind of amazing how many he runs into out here in the wilds of old Mexico. Also on that day, they pass the last mountains they will come to, and Pike remarks that they entered again into the Mississippi River Valley, which they had not seen in 6 months and 13 days. He was wrong about being in the Mississippi River Valley, but they had been heading north for quite a few days, and they were quickly approaching the Rio Grande, pretty much due west of modern-day Laredo, Texas. They were indeed leaving the mountains behind. Monday, June 1st. Pike and his men finally reached the Rio Grande River at the Presidio Rio Grande. And presidios, if you do not recall, are basically walled, fortified cities. So they get there, and Pike tells a story about how Salcedo, back in Chihuahua, had asked Pike about an American deserter. I will actually read this long quote from Pike because it is fascinating. Not only that Pike thinks this man could be a Burr agent, but also this guy's story is awesome. It's long, but it is worth it. When at Chihuahua, General Salcedo had asked me if I had not lost a man by desertion, to which I replied in the negative. He then informed me that an American had arrived at the Presidio Rio Grande in the last year, that he had at first confined him, but that he was now released and practicing physic, and that he wished me to examine him on my arrival. I therefore had him sent for. The moment he entered the room, I discovered he never had received a liberal education or been accustomed to polished society. I told him the reason that I had requested to see him, and that I had it in my power to serve him if I found him a character worthy of interference. He then related the following story. That his name was Martin Henderson, that he was born in Rockbridge County, state of Virginia, that he had been brought up a farmer, but that coming early to the state of Kentucky and Tennessee, he had acquired a taste for a frontier life, and that in the spring of 1806, himself and 4 companions had left the Say line in the district of St. Genevieve, Upper Louisiana, in order to penetrate through the woods to the province of Texas, that his companions had left him on the White, Arkansas River, and that he had continued on, that in swimming some western branch his horse sunk under him, and it was with difficulty that he had made the shore with his gun. Here he waited 2 or 3 days until his horse rose, and he then got his saddlebags, but that all his notes on the country, courses, etc. were destroyed. He then proceeded on foot for a few days, when he was met by 30 or 40 Osage warriors, who on his telling them he was going to the Spaniards were about to kill him. But on his saying he would go to the Americans, they held a consultation over him, and finally seized on his clothes, and divided them between them. Then his pistols, compass, dirk, and watch, which they took to pieces and hung in their noses and ears, then stripped him naked, and round his body they found a belt with gold pieces sewed in it. This they also took, and finally seized on his gun and ammunition, and were marching off to leave him in that situation. But he followed them, thinking it better to be killed than left in that state to die by hunger and cold. The savages, after some time, halted, and one pulled off an old pair of leggings and gave him, another moccasins, and a third a buffalo robe, and the one who had carried his heavy rifle had by this time become tired of his prize, they never using rifles, and they counted him out 25 charges of powder and ball, then sent 2 Indians who put him on a war trace, which they said led to American establishments. And as soon as the Indians left him, he directed his course, as he supposed, for St. Antonio. He then killed deer and made himself some clothes. He proceeded on and expended all his ammunition 3 days before he struck the Grand Road, nearly at the Rio Grande. He further added that since his being in the country, he had made, from information, maps of all the adjacent country, but that they had been taken from him. So that was his story, Martin Henderson's story. But what really happened to this guy? I had early concluded that he was an agent of Burr's, and was revolving in my mind whether I should denounce him as such to the commandant, but felt reluctant from an apprehension that he might be innocent. When one of my men came in and informed me that it was Traynor who had killed Major Bashir in the wilderness between Natchez and Tennessee when he was his hireling. He shot him when taking a nap at noon through the head with his own pistols. The governor of the state and the major's friends offered a very considerable reward for his apprehension, which obliged him to quit the state, and with an Amazonian woman, who handled arms and hunted like a savage, he retreated to the source of the White River, but being routed from that retreat by Captain Manny, James B. Manny, of the United States Army, and a party of Cherokees, he and his female companion bore west. And she, proving to be pregnant, was left by him in the desert, and, I was informed, arrived on the settlements of Red River, but by what means is to me unknown. The articles and money taken from him by the Osages were the property of the deceased major, I then reported the circumstances to Captain Borrello, who had him immediately confined until the will of Governor Cordero was known, who informed me, when at St. Antonio, he would have him sent to some place of perpetual confinement in the interior. Thus, vengeance has overtaken the ingrate and murderer when he least expected it. I thought that was a wild story. Both the fake one he told and the real one. And it really was the Wild West out there already. So this guy ended up being a crazy murderer and deserter indeed. Not only of the army, but of a pregnant woman. He's a monster. But I did think it was interesting that Pike suspected him of being a Burr agent. How much did Zeb know about the plot? Was he picking up pieces of it in the various towns he was visiting? That's what I assume. It was international headlines after all. Later that evening, the Americans watched what I believe to be a rodeo. Pike remarks rather comically that they weren't any good at it, but what they were good at was cursing. The cowboys' language, quote, would almost bring a blush on the cheek of the most abandoned of the female sex in the United States, end quote. I think that means like a whore. Also at the Presidio, Pike believes a soldier stole his compass, which he was not supposed to use, but kept using anyways, and he never did recover it. Pike then tells the story of this Frenchman that had accompanied them from Chihuahua, who had been their interpreter and guide and friend and spy. He was also a great cook. On June 2nd, after a few days of almost no food, the Frenchman scrounged up a delicious meal, a bottle of wine, and a pretty girl to serve them. When they asked the Frenchman where they got the food, he said, "Oh, I told one of the officers at the Commandant Salcedo had instructed the Spaniards to always feed the Americans." When they told Borrello this later, he quote-unquote laughed heartily. Pike mentions that they did in fact pay the officer for the meal. They would cross the Rio Grande on the 2nd and be out on the plains where Pike mentions the mosquitoes and horseflies were incredibly annoying. They also saw an immense amount of wild horses. On the 6th of June, they ran into a bunch of Spanish troops who were returning from the incursions into the U.S. when hostilities had been very high the year before. They would have essentially been frontline troops if the war had actually taken off. Also that day, Pike met some Lipan Apaches, or at least one man and his wife, before they entered a wooded forest. The first wooded forest since they'd left the Osage. They had been out on the plains, the mountains, and the desert since leaving them so many months prior. I bet it felt like home again. In San Antonio, they were treated exceptionally well, and Zeb and Doc Robinson stayed in the home of the governor. They went to a dance, and Pike met the sister of Malgare's wife. He had called Malgare's wife one of the prettiest he had seen in New Spain. Well, apparently the sister had similar genes because she too was, quote, one of the finest women we saw, end quote. The next few days were spent dining and toasting and drinking and talking politics as usual. They also attended a funeral of one of the captains of Nuevo León. Pike would learn in San Antonio that the Spaniards had in fact known since June of 1806 that he would be passing through the Great Plains and possibly heading to the Mexican mountains. Had Wilkinson told them this news for a small compensation? I would not doubt it. They also witnessed 200 dragoons march to the Gulf of America to, quote, look out for the English, end quote. And speaking of international intrigue, Pike writes a glowing report on Governors Herrera and Cordero. He really respects and liked these guys. At the end of his report of them, he says, they will always fight for Spain and the king, but, quote, should Bonaparte seize on European Spain, I risk nothing in asserting those two gentlemen would be the first to throw off the yoke, draw their swords, and assert the independence of their country, end quote. Pike, always the liberal idealist. He then states that, were it not for Herrera's prudence and knowledge and wisdom, the U.S. and Spain would in fact be at war. Herrera was told, in no uncertain terms, to attack the United States Army the previous year when Wilkinson and his men were in the disputed territory. But instead, Herrera disobeyed orders and came to an agreement with Wilkinson rather than all-out war, which again, he had been commanded to do so. Pike doesn't even give credit to Wilkinson, but rather to the Spanish Herrera. Herrera was deathly afraid of his punishment once he told the viceroy, but instead, they thanked him for avoiding war. And he said, and Pike wrote, quote, "I experienced the most unhappy period of my life, conscious I had served my country faithfully. At the same time, I had violated every principle of military duty." End quote. In a talk with Cordero, though, the governor brings up the Burr plot with Pike, but Cordero tells Zeb that it seems Wilkinson was not a co-conspirator. I'll talk more on that in a bit. They would leave San Antonio on the 14th of June, and they were heading to the Red River, and finally Natchitoches. But along the way, Pike ran into a people he called the Tankards, but who I believe are the Tonkawas. He says they were incredibly poor and naked, but at least they were free. He wrote, quote, "Their poverty was as remarkable as their independence," end quote. He gave one Tonkawa and one Comanche each a silk handkerchief. They would continue through swamps and across many rivers. It would rain. They ran into a settlement of runaway Negroes, which I thought was interesting. On the 29th, they would see their first non-deserter Americans. They continued, and on the 1st of July, Pike saw two things that he wrote about. First, Pike saw some Choctaw Indians who Pike remarked were well-dressed and had very nice furniture. He wrote that this, quote, "evidently marked the superiority of situation of those who bordered on our frontiers to those of the naked, half-starved wretches whom we found hanging around the Spanish settlements." End quote. He's like, even our Indians are better than the Spanish Indians. Which is probably true, actually, because of the way that each group treated the other one. The second thing Pike saw was the Stars and Stripes. He writes, quote, "Language cannot express the gaiety of my heart when I once more beheld the standard of my country waved aloft. All hail, cried I, the ever sacred name of country, in which is embraced that of kindred, friends, and every other tie, which is dear to the soul of man." End quote. So on July 1st, 1807, Pike's long and arduous and dangerous journey had finally come to an end. And so does his journal. But our episode has not. Awaiting Pike in Natchitoches was a letter from Wilkinson, and in this letter, Wilkinson claims that he had, quote-unquote, "detected, exposed, and destroyed Burr's conspiracy against the Constitution and government of the United States." He did not mention that he had been a part of it at one time, but he does tell Pike that unfortunately people are accusing me of being a co-conspirator, which he had been. He also tells Zeb that some people are saying your mission was also part of the conspiracy, so heads up. Well, I think that it was, although Pike did not know that. Zeb sends a letter back to Wilkinson in which he defends himself, and he writes that he had no knowledge of Burr's plans and he was never any part of it, and he will not entertain said idea any further. But he does add that while in Mexico, I did read quite a bit on this subject, and sometimes I read you had been arrested on account of your part of the plot. So it was true that he was reading headlines during his journey. I answered my own question. But Pike is quick to say that he, quote-unquote, never gave credit to the allegations against Wilkinson, but these allegations did cause Pike, quote, "great unhappiness, as I conceived the shafts of calumny were aiming at your fame and honor in a foreign country, where they had hitherto stood high and were revered and respected by every class." End quote. Wilkinson will write back, and rather tellingly, he will write to Pike, quote, "You must be cautious, extremely cautious how you breathe a word of the information you have acquired and the observations you have made, because the publicity may excite a spirit of adventure adverse to the interests of our government, or injurious to the maturation of those plans, which may be hereafter found necessary and justifiable by the government." End quote. So don't talk about what you saw, because you might incite even more filibusters into Texas and New Mexico, which would be contrary to and might complicate our government's possible future invasion. Wilkinson then tells Pike that starting immediately, you must make a report, and this report must include everything: the climate, geography, the people, arts, agriculture, routes, distances, military defenses, and a map. A very detailed map. Wilkinson said the president is awaiting your report, which you will make in Natchitoches. Which had to suck, because now he's got to stay there even longer, away from his family. Pike's notes were in a rough state. He had them all over his persons and his belongings and those of his men, including, if you recall, down the gun barrels, which he had to file off in order to reach the papers and get them back. This would not be an easy task, but he was prepared to do it. Well, he had been ordered to do it, so he had no choice. In a letter to Wilkinson about this report, though, of which he was to make multiple copies, he begged the general to please allow him to make as much of it as he could while on the road to Washington, D.C. Pike said, I'll work as hard as I can, even though my eyes only let me write for 1 hour a day, and then once my other men arrive from Chihuahua, I will, with your allowance, write at every moment of leisure on my journey to the capital. Pike assumed his men were right behind him. But unfortunately for everyone involved, that was not the case. We must now travel back to Mexico to find out what happened to those 8 men Pike was forced to leave behind. First of all, 6 of these men would not return for another 2 years. 1 won't be back until 1820, and 1 would never return. Shortly after Pike left Chihuahua, on May 4th, 1807, the rest of his men had just arrived to Presidio Carrizal, which is where I opened the episode. It's where Pike first found out about the Burr conspiracy. So his men arrive under guard at the Presidio, still armed with their swords, an important detail. In the Presidio, the Spanish sergeant, Juan Alguin, he was on horseback making his way to his home when he saw 2 of the Americans, Meek and Miller, apparently arguing in front of a store. 2 more Americans, Smith and Jackson, were watching the argument. Alguin, fearing the argument, which was heating up, would turn violent, he rode over to Meek and asked the man for his sword. Meek, without hesitation, gave over his sword and the belt it was on and continued arguing. This whole thing was over an apparent theft that Meek was accusing Miller of. Miller called Meek a liar and said Meek himself had stolen this vermilion pigment first from Pike. The argument continued to heat up as Alguin turned and rode away a few paces. It is important to note that Meek and Miller had both been drinking, so they were a little heated. Maybe it had been some tequila, which, So the name-calling continued until Meek punched Miller in the face. Miller returned the punch, and at this point, the other 2 Americans stepped in and broke them up. Jackson took Meek and Smith took Miller. This separation seemed to have worked, and Meek cooled off and brushed off his friend before kinda just walking away towards Alguin. By the time Meek reached Alguin, he was smiling and seemed friendly, but then broke the charade and grabbed his sword from Alguin's lap. Realizing a little too late this was about to indeed turn violent, the Spaniard grabbed the sword, as in the blade, to try and stop Meek from retrieving it, but obviously that ended poorly, and Alguin's hands were sliced. Meek got his sword and then ran all out towards Miller. Smith had gone inside the store, but after the commotion he came outside just in time to see Meek, quote, running very fast with the saber in his hand, end quote. Smith then heard Meek yell, quote, this is the way the American sergeants punish soldiers, end quote. And without even slowing his run, he plunged the sword directly into Miller's chest. Miller was only able to quietly say, I'm killed, I'm killed, I'm killed, before he collapsed and died. After all they'd been through. The surviving Americans were escorted to Chihuahua, where testimony was taken on June 17th by the Spanish and American witnesses. And then, they would have to wait 6 more months before the actual trial began, which was on December 20th. It would end on January 8th, 1808, without any verdict. So the trial would continue until May of 1808, again without a verdict. Unfortunately for the remaining men, Jackson, Vasquez, Smith, Carter, Sparks, Doherty, this whole trial would seriously delay their release. And that is because way back in May of 1807, the day after Miller's murder actually, Salcedo had written to the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Spain, as well as the King, informing them of Pike's expedition and his plans to release Pike back to the U.S., but to keep the man's papers, which proved he was guilty of espionage. The King himself would get this letter and immediately reprimand Salcedo for releasing Pike. He then commanded Salcedo that, quote, "You are not to permit yourself to grant freedom to the guilty ones unless there is a prior request from the American government." End quote. The guilty ones being these that remained and were not on their way back yet. They were guilty of espionage and invasion. The foreign minister then wrote the U.S. government and told them, "We do not punish Pike because we believe that is your job." He wrote, quote, "The American government will proceed to punish the delinquents with the appropriate severity, that the generous conduct observed toward them by the commanding General Salcedo is thus a proof of the confidence which is held that the criminals will be punished in the United States." End quote. I'm now going to read a paragraph from George R. Matthews that talks about Salcedo's defense to the king. He brings up an expedition I did not talk about, and that is the failed Freeman expedition of the Red River, where they were stopped by the Spanish and ordered back. Here is the quote. By comparing the Pike and Freeman expeditions, he explained that Freeman had been stopped on the Red River and obliged to return to the United States. Therefore, because the system I follow to maintain the integrity of these dominions is not to authorize any representative of the said government to arrive at any place whatsoever which he has not already arrived at, I believe that I was doing right in requiring Pike to withdraw as had been required of Freeman. This might have been a good argument if Pike had been forced to return to the Arkansas River from his stockade on the Conejos River. But Pike and his party were given an escort, first to Santa Fe, then Chihuahua, and finally across the width of Texas, giving them an opportunity to get the lay of the land, to observe Spanish troop numbers and presidios, and to talk with subjects contemplating rebellion. The two situations were not comparable. Salcedo must have realized his Freeman comparison was weak, because he quickly added that half of Pike's party remained detained, and that he had impeded most studiously the return of these prisoners until receipt of His Majesty's decision. Further, they will remain under arrest until the American government requests their freedom, taking cognizance of the excess and offering to punish the guilty ones appropriately. Salcedo concluded emphatically that all of this I inform your excellency for His Majesty's information and in justifiable satisfaction of my own actions. And all quotes. Everyone on the Spanish side really had fallen directly into Pike's and Wilkinson's plan. And what's more incredible is that they read this exact plan and then did it anyways. Pike and his 6 men got lucky. But these now 7 are not going to be so lucky. Salcedo wrote again to the foreign minister in Washington, D.C., and he said pretty much, "We have to let these guys go, except for Meek. We let Pike, the leader, go, but we're going to keep his subordinates? That doesn't seem right." While this was going on, in August of 1808, Wilkinson would write the Secretary of War, Dearborn, telling him that he was going to send a man down to Chihuahua to retrieve these 7 men. Dearborn responded with, "Yes, you will send an appropriate officer to San Antonio, who will then proceed to Chihuahua to get these men." Wilkinson then sent a letter to Salcedo, asking why the Americans were still detained, and he asked that they be released immediately. Amazingly, also in the letter, Wilkinson again claimed that Pike was never told to go to Santa Fe. It had all been an accident, I promise. He declared to Salcedo, quote, "on the word of a man of honor and a soldier," end quote. I wonder what Salcedo's reaction to this letter was. Because Salcedo knew that Wilkinson was a spy in the employ of the Spanish crown. It's amazing Salcedo never told Pike that, really. And the man saw the letter and the map, which proved Pike was going to Santa Fe all along. In October of 1808, Wilkinson chose his aide-de-camp, a man by the name of Captain Daniel Hughes, to go down to Chihuahua and retrieve the men. Hughes spoke French and he knew Herrera, and they were on good terms with the Spaniards down there. This man would arrive in Chihuahua on July the 5th, 1809. And this is where he would learn of the death of Miller at the hands of Meek. Hughes would finally arrive back to the United States with the 6 men, Vasquez, Doherty, Jackson, Smith, Carter, and Sparks, and they would be back on October 20th, 1809. Meek would be released by King Ferdinand VII in September 1820, just before granting Mexico its independence. Meek had spent 13 years in a Mexican prison. The king actually released all Americans in captivity in all of Mexico, including the surviving members of the Nolan Party, of which I have spoken of. I'm not sure why he did that, but there was probably some diplomatic reason. So now we have to go back to 1807. After Pike's return, his wife and daughter sailed down the various rivers until they were finally reunited. Meanwhile, Wilkinson headed to Virginia for the Aaron Burr trial. At the same time, Wilkinson was writing Secretary of War Dearborn and asking him how he should reply to the Salcedo letter that said, "Look, we have evidence that you planned this." Wilkinson did not know how to respond without giving away the game and humiliating the United States. Dearborn sent all this stuff to Jefferson, the president, who ultimately would write this lovely and long letter, which I will read. On the transfer of Louisiana by France to the United States, according to its boundaries when possessed by France, the government of the U.S. considered itself entitled as far west as the Rio Norte, but understanding soon after that Spain, on the contrary, claimed eastwardly to the river Sabine, it has carefully abstained from doing any act in the intermediate country, until these opposing claims should be explained and accommodated amicably, but that the Red River and all its waters belonged to France, that she made several settlements on that river, and held them as a part of Louisiana until she delivered that country to Spain, and that Spain, on the contrary, had never made a single settlement on the river, are circumstances so well known and so susceptible to proof that it was not supposed that Spain would seriously contest the facts or the right established by them. Hence, our government took measures for exploring that river by sending Mr. Freeman to proceed from the mouth upwards, Lieutenant Pike from the source downwards, merely to acquire the geography and so far enlarge the boundaries of science. Lieutenant Pike's orders were accordingly strictly confined to the waters of the Red River, and from his known observance of orders, I am persuaded that it must have been, as he himself declares, by missing his way, that he got on the waters of the Rio Norte instead of those of the Red River. That your Excellency should excuse this involuntary error, and indeed misfortune, was expected from the liberty of your character, and the kindness you have shown him are an honorable example of those offices of good neighborhood on your part, which it will be so agreeable to us to cultivate. To the same liberal sentiments, Pike must appeal for the restoration of his papers. You must have seen in them no trace of unfriendly views towards your nation, no symptoms of any other design than of extending geographical knowledge. And it is not in the 19th century, nor through the agency of your Excellency, that science expects to encounter obstacles. The field of knowledge is the common property of all mankind, and any discoveries we can make in it will be for the benefit of yours and of every other nation as well as our own. End quote. Oops. The president left out the fact that Pike had the map and the letter between he and Wilkinson, which stated Pike's intentions of infiltrating New Spain. Wilkinson, having such a finely written letter before him, just copied Jefferson's words almost entirely and then sent the letter to Salcedo. Pike, meanwhile, was writing to his superior saying pretty much, "There's no way that Spain is going to give us all the land we want without a fight. And pretty much, we can win that fight." He also wrote to the Natchez Herald and asked them to publish the account he had written about the 2 Nolan Party men, Zalman Cooley and David Farrow, thus keeping his promise to the 2 captives. Pike then wrote to Salcedo, asking where the heck the rest of his men were. He wrote that this was a, quote, "considerable private injury to myself," end quote. He also wrote in that letter to Salcedo to please return my papers, all of them, promptly. There are a lot of letters being spoken of now, but that's all we have. So over in Washington, the Spanish minister to the United States wrote to James Madison, the Secretary of State. He was writing to him to ask for a reimbursement of the $1,000 they had given Pike, but also in that letter, he wrote, quote, "According to the laws of nations, they," he means Alencaster and Santa Fe and Salcedo and Chihuahua, "they should have treated Dr. Robinson and the officer Pike as spies. They were detained in a countryside about which there is not the slightest litigation nor the least doubt that it belongs to my august sovereign." He continues, "It is true that the officer alleged that he had lost his way. This may be true, but it may also be a pretext, and probability is against it. You surely know that if similar excuses were to be regarded as sufficient, it would never be possible to condemn a spy." End quote. Now, he's right. Spain knew what was up, and they weren't going to let America just wave it off as an accident. The minister also told Madison that not only did Pike repeatedly contradict himself, but the map. He wrote, quote, "Suspicion of this officer was augmented by the fact that there was found on him a small drawing, a map showing the terrain situated between the Missouri and Santa Fe." End quote. The smoking gun. Pike had in fact drawn a dotted line from the Arkansas River over Raton Pass and down to Santa Fe, the Santa Fe Trail. Surprisingly, the minister did not mention the letter from Pike to Wilkinson, which Pike made a copy of and kept. Madison forwarded all of this to Jefferson, who said, "Yeah, we should pay him back," but argue against the minister by saying, quote, "that this government has never employed a spy in any case," end quote. And that is a lie. Just 2 years prior to all of this, Dearborn had instructed Wilkinson to, in fact, send spies to Texas. Dearborn told Wilkinson to send them in the character of hunters or traders. So it was a lie. Jefferson also told Madison to tell the minister the exact same story they'd been sticking to all along, that Pike got lost exploring waters that belonged to the United States. And surprisingly, Jefferson added that, quote, "However certain we are of a right extending Louisiana's boundary to the North River and participating of its navigation with Spain, yet Pike's voyage was not intended as an exercise of that right." End quote. Basically saying, we believe that the North River, the Rio Grande, is part of the United States, actually, but we didn't send Pike to explore that river. That was an accident. The minister was the Spanish minister. He was pleased that the U.S. was paying them back without a fight, but he must have been awestruck that not only is the U.S. continuing the ruse that Pike got lost, but that they think the border is the Rio Grande. It will be eventually. But it ain't yet. Again, if that were the boundary, that would place Albuquerque, Taos, and Santa Fe all in America. And didn't Jefferson just say that the Spanish haven't placed any settlements on the Red River, so that can't be their boundary? Well, then I reckon the Rio Grande certainly could not be the boundary of the United States with that logic. On September 17, 1807, Pike and his family arrived in New Orleans, but it wasn't just he and his wife and his daughter. He also brought along those 2 bear cubs that he purchased at the base of the Sierra Madre Mountains in Chihuahua from the Apaches. Pike fails to mention these bear cubs in the journal, but he did indeed buy 2 bear cubs, a boy and a girl. He then had his men carry them around in their laps while they rode on horseback. They then got too big, so they built a little cage they lashed to a mule. But every time they stopped, the bears would be set free, and eventually they just followed the Americans around. They basically became like dogs and only hung around the Americans because the Americans were the only ones dumb enough to feed them and play with them. But once in New Orleans, Pike shipped the bears off to President Jefferson as a gift. And then he and his family hopped on a boat bound for the East Coast. On January 26th of 1808, Pike presented his report to Dearborn in D.C. Ever the leader, an attached cover page begged the U.S. government to secure the release of his men, who were still at this time in Chihuahua. He wrote, quote, I, who was late their companion in difficulties and dangers, cannot so soon forget our forlorn situation, and the obligations I am under to them for the promptitude with which they encountered danger, the fortitude they exhibited, and the fidelity and attachment they evinced to their leader. I therefore hope that General Dearborn will take such measures as may be deemed expedient in order to restore those poor lads to the service of their country." End quote. Sadly, he still did not know Meek had murdered Miller in a fit of drunken rage. In February, while Pike was still in D.C., Congress debated on how Pike should be compensated when, all of a sudden, one congressman asked if Pike was tied to the Burr conspiracy. Zeb immediately heard the accusations and defended himself before Dearborn would come to his aid, which greatly relieved Pike. Politics, man. But Pike really was relieved, especially when Dearborn told him that both the president and the public owe him and are proud of him. Pike wrote to Dearborn, quote, "The confidence of the executive, Thomas Jefferson, and the respects of our fellow citizens must be the grand desiderata of every man of honor who wears a sword in the Republican armies of the United States." End quote. In the end, Pike would never be paid extra or given lands for his adventure by Congress. I mean, that's what Lewis and Clark got. And this was because he was tied to Wilkinson, who was rumored to be tied to Burr. Although neither men were ever punished for their treasonous plotting. Burr and Wilkinson. Too many in Washington thought that Pike had been in on it. He was on board with being arrested, yes, but he was not part of the Burr plot, as I have said many times. In 1809, Pike would be sent to his new post in New Orleans with a new rank of major. While his exploration didn't provide immediate military benefits, his notes and observances would be useful in the eventual war against Mexico. And Pike really did succeed in all of his mission parameters, except for one. He never did find and talk to a Comanche chief. But finding the headwaters of the Arkansas, making peace between the Osage and Pawnee, and meeting their leaders were all a complete success. His book would eventually be published, and it was extremely popular, and it was translated into several languages, making it an international bestseller. He would make 80% of all sales, and the book was $3 at print. So I'm sure that made up for the lack of a bonus that Congress never gave him. And this book would awaken the American public's attention to the wonders of the West, especially the Great American Desert. His book would be the #1 guide to the West until Josiah Gregg's 1844, The Commerce of the Prairies. And in that book by Gregg, he cites Pike's work as being the origin of the Santa Fe trade. Gregg claimed Pike's book, quote, "whose exciting descriptions of the new El Dorado spread like wildfire throughout the western country." End quote. The book really did open up a new road of commerce to New Mexico on the Santa Fe Trail, especially after Mexican independence. His maps of the region were incredibly useful for those interested in trading with the far-flung region. The first two men to attempt this trade would be Robert McKnight and James Baird in 1812. They had 6 mules loaded with goods, and they made it to Santa Fe, using Pike's journal and maps. But they were immediately arrested and turned back, and all their goods were confiscated. And pretty much every American until late 1820 were arrested and either sent back or sent to prison in Chihuahua. One of the last men to be arrested doing this trade was a 19-year-old man named David Meriwether in 1820. He was arrested and kept in Santa Fe during the reign of Governor Malagradez, the very same Malagradez who had accompanied Pike and had become his friend. Later that year, Meriwether would be released, but he would return to Santa Fe as governor himself from 1853 to 1855, after America conquered the territory. And stay tuned for that saga. When war broke out between England and the U.S. again, Wilkinson attempted 2 campaigns against the Redcoats, but both failed. He would be discharged from the army in 1815. The following year, in 1816, he would write a memoir to clear his name from the Burr conspiracy. And then after that, he'd be appointed the envoy to Mexico during their War of Independence, which they would finally win in 1821. That same year, Wilkinson would ask the Mexican government for a sprawling estate in Texas. He would never receive it. He would die in Mexico City in 1825 at 68 years old. After the expedition, Doc Robinson became a very interesting guy. During the Napoleonic Wars, he was very worried that England, like she had done with India, would conquer all of Spain's Latin American colonies and use the wealth they would accumulate there against the United States. So he had plans to help the Mexicans gain their independence from Spain and keep it. Zeb would write in 1808 that it would only take 20,000 American auxiliary forces allied with Mexican insurgents to beat Spain. Well, John Hamilton Robinson was going to use that information. At this time in the U.S., its citizens were all on board with freeing her southern neighbors from the clutches of Spanish tyranny, as was their revolutionary zeal. Robinson believed that an American fighting for Mexico was just as good as an American fighting against England, which was happening during this time with the whole War of 1812. Robinson was also very adamant that the U.S. boundary should be the Rio Grande, just like Jefferson had wanted it. In David Narrett's Liberation and Conquest, John Hamilton Robinson and U.S. Adventurism Toward Mexico, 1806 to 1819, he speaks of Robinson, and this is what he said. From 1806 to 1819, he served successively as explorer and spy, a State Department envoy, a recruiter of filibusters, a volunteer Mexican officer, and finally a mapmaker of imperialistic intent. He exemplified an era in which numerous non-state actors, foreign revolutionaries, mercenaries, spies, and freebooters, as Rafe Blaufarb writes, influenced the supercharged international context of Latin American independence movements. End quote. In 1812, the same year Pike was fighting the English to the north, Robinson was sent back down into Chihuahua to talk with his old buddy, Salcedo, the Commandant General. The president himself, James Madison, had sent Robinson down there, but it wasn't his idea. It had actually been Zebulon Montgomery Pike's. On his way north, he met with the president and suggested Robinson for this mission. The Madison administration was thinking that if Mexico broke from Spain, then the internal provinces, which Salcedo was in charge of, would probably break away from Mexico City. So Robinson was sent down there to see what he could do in regards to the neutral ground, the same place that Wilkinson and Herrera had created in 1806, thereby averting war at that time. Madison believed if a bunch of armed revolutionaries were roaming the countryside, they'd need to stay out of this disputed territory. Robinson, though, was also sent down there to tell Salcedo that, look, we're going to occupy Florida so that England can't stage there against us. So there's a lot going on here. Too much for this episode. But Madison was also allowing filibusterers all over the frontier. One even took Santa Fe briefly, despite Robinson warning the Spanish that it was about to happen. That warning was also part of Madison's plan, who at the same time as allowing filibusters was distancing himself from said filibusters that he was encouraging. So again, there's a lot happening. America wanted Texas and Florida, and eventually all of the West, and this war down south could provide that opportunity. But unfortunately, the English had invaded yet again. I almost wonder if it was to stop us from taking the West. Eventually, Robinson would reach Salcedo, and the two would have a heated argument. Salcedo was not impressed with neither Robinson nor the Republic of the United States, and he would not entertain anything from Madison. But while there, Robinson ran into two Mexicans who wanted American help in both the Gulf and New Mexico. Robinson said he would further this message to the president. Back in Washington, Robinson and the president grew pretty close from what I could tell. I kind of read two narratives here, but they grew close, and Robinson advised the president on all manner of filibustering from Florida to Cuba to New Mexico and even Mexico, and of course Texas. All this whole time, Robinson was also attempting to raise his own army. It should be noted, too, that Robinson had been married for this entire series. He loved his wife, and before he dies, she will give him 4 children. Robinson's private army schemes were broken up when he was sued, but Madison bailed him out, at which point Robinson headed west to continue to build an army. But Madison's Secretary of State, Monroe, yes, of the Monroe Doctrine, he had had enough of Robinson, and he ordered every Western governor to halt Robinson's planned invasion of New Spain, soon to be Mexico. Federal and local officials, it seems, were totally on board with Robinson's plan, though. Officials in Louisiana and Mississippi liked the idea, especially the governor of Louisiana. He was an ardent Jeffersonian and proto-Knight of the Golden Circle. He wanted to see all of the Americas free from European dominance. Amazingly, by 1814, Robinson had been put in charge of a military junta at Natchez, which consisted solely of U.S. nationals. Their goal was to, quote, take possession of the district of country called Texas, end quote. But that filibuster would never happen. By now, Robinson was both an American Republican patriot and a Mexican freedom fighter. He wanted to see Mexico free, but also inhabited by wealthy and enterprising Americans. He painted Mexico as extremely foreign, yes, but totally open to U.S. influence. And make no mistake, Robinson's actions in this decade, after his exploration with Pike, it had a big impact on men in America who had designs on New Mexico, and especially Texas. All of his invading Mexico plans were put on hold, though, when Britain invaded New Orleans in 1814. Robinson only saw action in the hospital. Remember, he was a physician. But many of the men who wanted to invade Mexico, both friends and rivals, he had plenty of rivals, they joined up with Andrew Jackson to fight. After the war, and in 1815, Robinson was heading back down to Mexico. He wanted to ask the fledgling Mexican Congress for funds to bring down Americans to fight. Once he made it down to the insurgents, he yet again asked to be made a citizen of that country. I guess the first time it was Spain, but this time it was Mexico. The Mexican Congress said, negative. You have to be born here, and you have to be Catholic. You have to be born in a country to be a citizen of said country, and you have to have a shared religion and belief system. Wow. What a great idea. Regardless, Robinson spent some time helping the revolutionaries and even saved a bunch of their lives. By 1818, he was back in the States, and having grown weary of battlefields, he began making maps. And he truly made an incredible map. His masterpiece was called A Map of Mexico, Louisiana, and the Missouri Territory, including also the state of Mississippi, Alabama Territory, East and West Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and part of the island of Cuba, by John H. Robinson, M.D. It is a 5-foot by 5-foot square, and it not only shows borders and geography, including rather prominently Pikes Peak, but it also has a lot of information on the areas within this 5-foot by 5-foot massive piece of land. It also has he and Pike's journey, as well as Cortez's journey, which is pretty cool. I would like to get my hands on one of these, honestly. Maybe not 5 feet by 5 feet. And one last thing about the map. He put the American boundary at the Rio Grande. Unfortunately for Robinson, he seemed to have caught some fever while down in Mexico, probably malaria, which, let me tell you from personal experience, it sucks. But Robinson would die in Natchez on September 19, 1819, from an unknown illness. So for Pike, this is the end. We're going to finish up with Pike. It's just tough. Only a few years after his return from the West in Old Mexico, Pike would fight in the War of 1812 and eventually be promoted to brigadier general. It was another cold slog through winter snows, like his Mississippian adventure and his western one, but he was headed towards Canada, Just like his expedition to the west, many of his men lost limbs to frostbite. It was a hard campaign. And then they boarded ships on Lake Ontario, and it was here he wrote his brother, quote, "If we go into Canada, you will hear of my fame or of my death." End quote. With Pike's leader, Henry Dearborn, ex-Secretary of War, he was too seasick to lead his troops ashore. I guess lake sick. So Pike had his men board boats at dawn, and they rowed through bullets fired by redcoats and Indians and cannonballs towards the shore. Many did not make it, but the cannons on the boats, the American boats, aided the Americans as they stormed the beach. And these cannons really did good work. Skeletons are still found from this battle from over 100 years ago. Pike, still on the boat, would exclaim, quote, "By God, I can't stay here any longer. Come, jump into the boat." End quote. So he and another soldier rowed to catch up to his men who were being battered. Eventually, the Americans would take the beach and run into the forest with their green and blue coats, blending in with the Canadians and Englishmen retreating. Sharpshooters were picking off the retreating redcoats as a band played Yankee Doodle. So while researching this battle, I read all of the books I had, and they just kind of gloss over it. But I found an article on Substack by the Toronto Time Traveler. His name is Adam Bunch, and I thanked him for writing this, and I'm just going to read this very good and very tough story about the fate of our hero, Zebulon Montgomery Pike. Hours passed before they finally emerged from the forest at the ruins of an old French trading post, Fort Rouillé. There, a defensive battery was waiting for them, armed with artillery. It opened fire, grape shot hurtling through the air towards them. Pike ordered his buglers to sound the advance, and the Americans rushed forward as their ships bombarded the battery. Before the Americans could reach it, the battery exploded. A British soldier had accidentally dropped a lit fuse into a pile of ammunition cartridges. The blast ripped the battery apart, knocked out one of its guns, and killed 10 of its defenders. The rest had no choice but to retreat, scrambling back across the open ground into the relative safety of Fort York. Zebulon Pike waited. It was now a little after noon. With the warships pounding away at the fort and the defenders all withdrawn from the field, he assumed the battle was coming to an end. He ordered his men to halt within striking distance of the fort and lie down while they waited for a white flag to appear. Pike had only minutes left to live. He took a seat on a tree stump, spending his final moments questioning a prisoner while he waited for Fort York to surrender. That's when it happened. The ground shook, and a great roar split the air, so loud it could be heard all the way across the lake in Niagara. There was a flash and a shockwave that raced out from the fort, hurling the American soldiers backwards, some soaring 20 meters through the air. It burst lungs and tore through intestines. A great shower of debris, stone, wood, and metal, was thrown high into the air before it came racing back toward the ground in a deadly hail. It tore through skin and crushed bone. Dozens of American soldiers lay dead. Hundreds were wounded. The great magazine of Fort York, storing tens of thousands of pounds of gunpowder, cannonballs, and musket rounds, had exploded. The blast was one of the biggest in the entire history of North America. The British general had ordered the destruction of the Grand Magazine as his soldiers abandoned the fort, not wanting the ammunition and supplies to fall into American hands. The explosion must have been bigger than even he imagined it would be. Some of his own men were killed in the blast, but the full force was directed toward the attacking Americans. Zebulon Pike was right in its path. As the smoke cleared, he was found lying on the ground, crushed by a boulder with his ribs caved in. There are a few different versions of what happened then. Some say he was carried back to his ship to die. Some that he spent his final moments with his head resting on a bloody Union Jack. Others suggested that he used his final breath to urge his men to victory. "Push on, my brave fellows, and avenge your general." End all quotes. A few months later, Zeb's wife would receive this heartbreaking letter, which he had written on the deck of the ship before the attack. My dear Clara, we are now standing on and off the harbor of York, which we shall attack at daylight in the morning. I shall dedicate these last moments to you, my love, and tomorrow throw all other ideas but my country to the winds. I have no new injunction, no new charge to give you, nor no new idea to communicate. Yet, we love to commune with those we love, more especially when we conceive it may be the last time in this world. Should I fall, defend my memory, and only believe, had I lived, I would have aspired to deeds worthy of your husband. Remember me, with a father's love, a father's care to our dear daughter, and believe me to be, with the warmest sentiments of love and friendship, your Montgomery.
Came down from Alamosa, across the Rio Grande, to track a killer lion, lost his fear of man. First seen around El Rito, he laid a rancher down, killed the rancher's daughter, is gone out of sound. And the purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Not much trace of man out here, the painted canyon walls, the ancient pagan hunters show could chase and fall. Now the lever-action rifle and horses change the game, but their ghosts still hunt beside me, the chase still feels the same. And the purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. My father left me are ranging out of sight. I stand up in my saddle in the early morning light. I can see the good gyp circle, and I know it won't be long till the canyon rings are striking cry, the lion will be found. And the purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Finds a lonely juniper to make his final stand. 3 faithful hounds lie dying, blood shining on the sand. And the good gyp leaps up in the air, as low as murder charge. My rifle cracks, a whisper late, I can feel his iron jaw. The purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the eagle sees us falling, the hunter and the prey. His shadow crosses lifeless bodies, where side by side we lay. And the good gyp sits upon the rim, and all alone she cries a death song for her master, killed the mighty lion. Purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Yeah, the purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds.
Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.